The seminar today is in two parts with a break between. It's a great pleasure for me. I'm Line Dortland, by the way, representing Kode. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome my colleague from MASPI, our collaborator on the Indigenous Histories exhibition, Guilherme Jufreda, who is going to give us a short intro to the project in itself. It will then be followed by introductions by curators and then a talk moderated by Matthias Danbolt. Welcome, Guilherme.
Hello everyone, are you hearing me? So, I'm delighted to participate in the official opening of Indigenous Histories here in Bergen this week. This event marks and extends years of dedicated work of many individuals, both within and outside our museums, the São Paulo and Bergen Art Museums, MASP and Code, who have engaged in discussions on this topic since 2017. When the first seminar was held in São Paulo. Today, we open the sixth seminar on this topic, the first here in Bergen, with so many people that have participated, developed, and collaboratively shaped, and some new people who is joining this long research project with us today. I'm very grateful to the Indigenous History curators, most of them present here in this auditorium today. Abraham Cruz Villegas, Bruce Johnson McLean, Edson Caiapó, Irene Snarbi, Jocelyn Pirain, Cássia Borges Carajá, Michelle Lavallee, Nigel Burrell, Renata Tupinambá, and Sandra Gamarra. Though he was unable to join us today, I would also like to thank Adriano Pedrosa, with whom I coordinated the project and edited its catalog. Since 2016, MASPI, where I work as a curator since 2018, has designed its programming around the exploration of diverse histories of art, in plural. Our goal is to reinterpret the legacy of culture in its visual representation by engaging with social markers of difference, incorporating into the museum narratives and paradigms previously overlooked by the canonical lineage of so-called art history. Differentiation, juxtaposition, and comparison were crucial for Indigenous histories. Each of these 12 curators, researchers, and artists who we have invited to lead the project lives and works in a cultural milieu in which the interaction of Indigenous arts with contemporary practice, as well as the histories of colonial violence and reparations through museums and exhibitions, the relations with the art market, and even before, the presence of Indigenous people in 19th century or even earlier academic representations by traveling painters, for example, and the ways in which pre-colonial objects were preserved or looted all occurred and continue to occur in very different ways. However, despite their social and personal diversity, a profound connection unites this context. Indigenous populations are defined by deep and ancestral ties to territories invaded during European colonization beginning in the 15th century. Through enduring resistance and struggle, their practice, materialities, and visual traditions have evolved over centuries, forming narrative and visual paradigms that are often marginalized by academia and museums. The exhibitions of works by Indigenous artists, sometimes in friction with non-Indigenous too, in some sections of the exhibitions, opens new avenues for articulating alternative art histories that challenge conventional discourse and formal markers, expanding the limits of what defines an art object, its effects and possibilities. Indigenous histories aim to shed light on visual regimes that have resisted the homogenizing forces of imperialism enduring for centuries outside the logic, confines, and categories imposed by dominant art historical narratives and their integration into criticism and the art market. As a result, numerous visual traditions have developed in parallel, often silenced or dismissively labeled as crafts or cultures. This highlights the elitism and colonial underpinnings inherent in the traditional distinctions between what is considered art and what is not. In this exhibition, we find numerous indications of how diverse visual traditions manifest themselves beyond the conventional notions of art as separate from social life. There is a long-standing debate in specialized literature over whether art is a concept that transcends cultural boundaries, applying universally across different traditions. The exhibition and its accompanying book, Indigenous Histories Catalog, offer several insights into this question, I think. I'm particularly struck by the Sami concept of duoji, which, as curator Irene Snarby describes, encompasses worldview, spirituality, knowledge, conceptions of nature, creativity, and the creation of objects that reflect life. It centers on the aesthetic of everyday activities and behaviors. To paraphrase Snarby, if aesthetic infuse every aspect of life, is a distinct concept of art necessary? These works not only challenge our perceptions of what constitutes art, but also prompt us to reconsider the significance of items deemed artworks within museum contexts. By incorporating diverse narratives into major institutions, we engage with different ontological frameworks concerning images and objects, which include alternative views on their creating, meaning, effects, boundaries, and roles within the network that create and utilize them. This raises a pivotal question. Could this be an opportunity to influence how Western art engage with these diverse paradigms and visual regimes? The fundamental distinction is that objects in Western contexts are often perceived as dead or inert, whereas indigenous objects are seen as catalysts of life. What benefits might arise from infusing life into the objects through the rest of the museum? How do indigenous regimes of visuality contribute to our reimagining of canonic theories of imagery, art, the power of images, and the agency of art objects? Such contributions could open new avenues for exploring the magical and the non-canonical aspects of the museum, presenting alternative ways to value aesthetic engagements. Indigenous Histories marks a significant milestone in the history of exhibition on indigenous art by major museums and institutions. I would love to hear from my colleagues how they view its position within this constellation of contradictions and potentialities of exhibiting living objects in space that historically treat them as inert. Exhibiting living things and images in the preserved space of museums has the potential to challenge certain assumptions, but also to enhance these other narratives and art histories, maintaining them in our collection. This effort is maybe crucial for preventing living works, objects, and histories from almost fading or disappearing once more. Thank you.
As you can observe, I need some technical assistance. Thank you for your patience. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce the first participant. Wasson Cross represents the region of Canada in the Indigenous Histories exhibition. She holds the position of Associate Curator, Indigenous Ways and Decolonizations at the National Gallery of Canada. She is a PhD candidate in cultural mediations at Carleton University, where her research revolves around contemporary and historical Haudenosaunee beadwork and material culture. Welcome, Wasandia.
Thank you. How do I move it forward? Okay, how do I press to move it forward? The arrow, okay. Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Wasandio. I am Ganyakahaga from the Mohawk Nation of Kahnawake, which is in a region that is now referred to as southern Quebec. So I'd just like to briefly talk about my own practice as in relation to my cultural background. So I would like to speak to the need for and the importance of self-representation of Indigenous people, namely within the art, historical, and gallery context. Historically, so speaking from my cultural background, a lot of what has been written in the past about our people and our material culture has been done through non-Indigenous anthropologists and ethnologists from that lens. And so we're in a moment right now in North America, especially of reclaiming that. And a part of that is to have Indigenous people in roles of importance, specifically, in the curatorial field, in the upper echelons of, museum management, really to speak to those things rather than have it be a tokenistic role where the person is just brought in for a moment to say something and then, they're no longer a part of that institution. So where I work at the National Gallery of Canada, the department I work in is called Indigenous Ways and Decolonization, and it's a department that was only founded about 2 years ago. So this was in response to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which the report came out about a decade ago now. And one of those recommendations was for Indigenous people to be able to have access to their own culture and to be able to have roles in speaking about that culture and reclaiming that, and that would be sort of a form of reconciliation. There are many other recommendations in that report, but I think that recommendation, which included access to languages, was the one that was really more fleshed out, and institutions really jumped on those opportunities to create new positions within universities and other cultural institutions to have permanent staff who were Indigenous. So within my department, there are 7 people, so there's 4 curators, and there are 3 people who are in more senior management roles. So that's important too, because they can speak for us at this higher level to really step in when things don't seem right, and to really advocate for putting Indigenous views first, especially in a territory where, that belongs to Indigenous people. So it's sort of a way of taking that back. And although it isn't perfect, and some would say we should use the word conciliation rather than reconciliation, because putting the re in front of it means that we're taking something, like we're going back to something that existed, but it never really existed in the first place. So yeah, there's this constant building towards having that representation and bringing that sort of power back. So speaking from my own cultural background, I am Kanien'kehá:ka, which is also known as Mohawk, which is one of the nations who are part of the Haudenosaunee, otherwise known as the Iroquois Confederacy. So within our culture, within our history, we have a very important tenet that is known as the Great Law of Peace. I won't go into the whole history of it because there's a lot to it. But basically there's three main concepts of this. Skana, Kariwio, Kazastansera. Peace, power, and righteousness. So the peace is pretty clear, to become respectful to people, to have that mind where you don't have anger or prejudice when you come together, that you have that peaceful mind. Kariwio, the righteousness is of being also of the right mind. So it's hard, the English translations don't really speak to it. And Kazastansera is power. And power here not meaning a physical power, not meaning necessarily political power the way we understand the word today, but it is more the individual's will, and how do you interact with the world? How do you interact with living beings, with humans, with spirits, with nature? And when we come together between our nations or with other nations, it's important to have these concepts in your mind. And one thing, when a visitor, historically, when a visitor would come to a Haudenosaunee village, we wouldn't first, the interaction wouldn't be hostile. We would be welcoming and offer that person water. Not only, water being an essential to life, but also symbolically as it clears your throat so that you can speak of a good mind of hostile interaction. So yeah, coming back to those ideas and curation, within our department, we're really trying to impose the idea of consensus building. So this is also a tenet of Haudenosaunee law, where when groups come together, one side has an idea and the other side has another agenda, but the idea is not to have one win over the other, but to talk it out and come to a consensus, which usually means compromise on both sides. So nobody 100% gets what they want, but it means you understand what the other person said, they understand you, and there's that mutual respect, and that's how you move forward, is by having that consensus, so you know that you're all on a level. And this is also where the Americans got their idea of democracy from, but it's not, the way they practice it is not the way we did, because theirs is not truly equal. So yeah, it's all about respect and reciprocity. And thinking about that and applying that to my own work, I've been lucky enough as a Kanien'kehá:ka woman to be able to work with other Kanien'kehá:ka artists and really work to interpret that work in a place that comes from the inside rather than the outside. So in speaking to one artist, he said oftentimes when non-Indigenous people or non-Haudenosaunee people write about his work, they don't get it, or they don't know how to apply it, like to interpret that for others. But if it's a Haudenosaunee person, they already know, they know where that comes from and can interpret that. And many visual artists are visual artists because they feel more comfortable expressing themselves visually rather than verbally or written word. So as curators, it's our role really to translate and interpret those ideas behind the work, into writing, into speaking. So I just wanted to quickly go through some recent. I didn't include one photo, was Melissa General. She's a Ganyakahaga from Six Nations. So she has work that is in the current Indigenous Histories exhibition. So currently working with Shelly Nero, who is also from Six Nations, on a retrospective of her work. So she's a very prominent Ganyakahaga artist, working in photography and multimedia. So these are just examples of some work that are in the collection at the National Gallery. I'm working on a current solo exhibition with Skawanadi, who is from my community, and she's really breaking barriers and working with the digital realm and really seeing that digital cyberspace world as a place where everyone is equal and a place to kind of imagine a more inclusive future. And this is another installation. Greg Statz, who is also Ganyakahaga, and he is this year's one of the recipients of the Governor General's Awards in Visual and Media Arts. So again, just these artists are expressing ideas that draw upon our history, on our stories, on the great law, and it's an honor to be able to do this work. I think it's important for this to happen everywhere through many cultures, for people to be able to speak for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now it's a pleasure to introduce Nigel Borrell, representing the region of Aotearoa, New Zealand. He is a curator at the Auckland War Memorial Museum and has curated several exhibitions, co-curated also for the 9th Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art in Australia. And I'm looking forward to hearing about centering Indigenous knowledge in understanding contemporary art. Please welcome Nigel.
Morena, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here in Norway for the first time, and it's lovely to see the curatorium again and the artists that are part of the exhibition. A warm thank you to Kura and for hosting us and for being such a generous partner to the show. It's pretty special. And we're all jet lagged in a different country this time, so it's not Brazil, it's Norway. But it's a pleasure to be here. I thought I would talk briefly around the thematic for the Māori section of Indigenous Histories, rupturing representation, and I suppose imply the way in which Indigenous knowledge is embedded in the way in which those artists present their practice and their ideas. Rupturing representation was really thinking about the forms of representation that have either been imposed on Māori artists and Indigenous artists through colonisation and through, I suppose, the wielding of the art canon, which is one of those mechanisms of colonisation in itself, and how our Indigenous artists, or in this case Māori artists, have spoken back to those forms of representation to centre themselves and to centre their ideas at the very core of what they're trying to present and authenticate in a contemporary space. So when I looked at that idea as a way of thinking about a generous way into a window of contemporary Māori art for audiences that are really trying to understand so much when you come to an exhibition like this, because it's loaded with cultural knowledge, it's loaded with specific ideas, and it's loaded with different nation knowledge, if you like. So it's a lot for audiences to try and navigate. And for me, it was a way to think about what can I offer, which is an opening conversation, if you like, for anyone to come into that space and to engage without needing to know anything about Māori art or contemporary Māori art and culture, but still come away with an understanding of some of those ideas. And there are three distinct, I think, beats within that show which speak to that idea. One is the way in which our first generation of Māori artists that went through the Western Art School in the 1950s and 60s presented their ideas. Often they were being termed the Māori modernists because they engaged with the Western art traditions of the time, modernism, abstract expressionism, and so forth. So art history is often talked about them in those ways. But often the same critique or the same discourse around their contribution to art history in New Zealand has never touched on the content of what they were looking at. And I always found that quite fascinating as a Māori person, that the very content and the ideas that they were expressing were often overlooked for their way of grappling or mastering aesthetically modernism or abstract expressionism. So, you know, sometimes these ideas are self-serving in terms of who's speaking to whom and what knowledge is being reinforced in those conversations and in those art learnings. So for me, it was a chance to talk about those artists of that generation in a different way, and how can we rupture those ideas of representation that sit around the way in which they've been termed and coined the Māori modernists. And when I look at their work, a lot of the ideas that they're investigating are essentially Māori concepts to do with creation, to do with whenua, to do with land, to do with their tribal upbringing, to do with their locale, and to do with values around manaakitanga, which means generosity or how you look after people. This idea of whakapapa, which is about lineage and connection to both land and to people. These sort of ageless philosophies were in their work and are in our cultural visual arts and still are. And so it was an opportunity to recenter that conversation as important, was just as important as this conversation with modernism. Another distinct theme was looking at ko whaiwhai, which is a distinctly Māori visual language. Within our art traditions, ko whaiwhai, the scroll patterns that are represented in the meeting house. And so with this exhibition, it was a chance to really step through in three examples or three artist practices, the way in which ko whaiwhai painting represents that tradition uniquely in a Māori art context. So we have a piece that's come from an architectural structure in the house, which you could say is a traditional piece of ko whaiwhai painting. Then we have Sandy Adsett next to it in green, who was a real, phenomenal trailblazer in the 70s and 80s, because he took the language of ko whaiwhai, which was through anthropological research and practice, has been commodified into just red, black and white. But we know that within those traditions we used all types of colours and practices. And what Sandy Adsett did in the 70s is that he reinvested colour as a way of thinking about ko whaiwhai. So he really ruptured the traditional gaze around how we think about that art practice. And in so doing has been a real innovator in that practice. So an amazing piece of his work's also in the exhibition. And on a side note, it's lovely to see him acknowledged and included in the latest Venice Biennale. So there's a piece of his practice from that same series on display there. So seeing our artists on that stage, especially when they're in the 80s and they're still alive to appreciate it, is really special. So Sandy sits next to Ngātai Taiapa, who's the most recent practitioner of kōwhaiwhai. And he takes kōwhaiwhai into three-dimensional realms. So his work is the very colourful pastel colours, and he mixes the pastel colours in acrylic with the very deep brown and burnt sienna colours, which are natural earth pigments called kokowai. So they're mixing really both traditional ways of creating pigment and colour along with contemporary. And so for me, the opportunity of thinking about kōwhaiwhai and centering a uniquely Māori painting tradition within a show like this was important. I suppose another really important thing that's come through in the way that the shows come together is the way in which at least 50% of the artists are queer in the representation in the Aotearoa New Zealand section. And explicitly and implicitly, some of them are exploring and deconstructing those ideas around sexuality and gender identity in their practice. And Mahia Te Kore, Tanu Ngango, and accompanied by Lady Shaka, really represent the way in which this generation are creating new worlds to think about their identity. And there's a term called world building, which I really love. So thinking about this idea of how they want to see their identity outside of those confines that have been imposed upon us, both through colonisation and the way in which we see ourselves. So that's probably the most recent conversation taking place back home, is how artists are reclaiming their identity in many ways. So that as a theme was really important to me, to represent with authenticity, but also to make sure that it was represented in a welcoming and in an accessible way. So the VR work Ko Te Kore, which sits in the middle of the space, which is the lit tomb, if you like, the po, is a VR work that you move around the room with, and the figure appears on your tablet or your iPhone. And it's called Atua, the work. And it's looking at our creation story. So within Māori creation narratives, our existence begins in a place called Te Kore, which is the great nothingness, the empty void. And that morphs into Te Pō, the great darkness, or the long night. And then from there, that ruptures into Te Ao Marama, the world of light and life, which we live in today. And what I love about Atua is that Tanu and Mahia Te Kore have looked at the state of potential, which Te Kore, the great nothingness, is. So it's a space where no life exists, but the potential for life is everywhere. And they've taken that as a way of thinking about the way of creating identities, world building, but also finding space as non-binary artists or queer artists to stand and to be able to speak to the potential of being. So their work is speaking to that, but also harks back to our oldest philosophies, which is our creation story. For me, I've touched on just three of the main elements that are represented in that exhibition or in that section, but in many ways they're repositioning Māori knowledge, Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing as the first conversation that they want you to engage with. And that's, as the curator, how I've positioned the show as well. So it's not about having to know about modernism. It's not having to know about other Western art, painting traditions, but it's actually about centering a different sphere and approach to thinking about how to engage with their practice. And I think it's also about agency and authenticity, and making sure that the presentation of their ideas is done in a way that is empowering to them and to us, first and foremost. I think that is me.
So I need some technical help down here. Can Sophia come down and help me, please? Nettverk. Ja. I'm having network problems. They can be solved, luckily. Jeg har ikke nettverk her, og den er digital. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nigel. Yeah, you can just chat a little bit with your neighbor. Han trenger ikke vise meg. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Abraham Cruz Villegas, representing the region of Mexico. Has a very rich career as a curator, among other projects. In 10th Biennial of Havana, at the 50th Biennale in Venezia, among others. In 2016, Harvard University Press published his collected writings, The Logic of Disorders. Abraham will start with a very poignant question, Indigenous. Please welcome.
Hello. Well, I wanted to show you some images, but mostly are from the exhibition, so it's okay if we don't have them. Seriously. Yeah, it's okay. Maybe just one image is not from the exhibition, and it's from an artist that I recently discovered. That's why he's not in the exhibition. But I will read what I wrote better. With some time and distance from the very process of making research, speaking with artists, institutions, curators, and collections, from installing the works in Sao Paulo to this very moment here in Bergen, a completely different environment, of course, many ways, I want to reconnect with an early reflection about what it means indigenous in 21st century. The image that I wanted to show you is an artwork by Salvador Sharicata, who's a Purépecha artist from the town of Cherán. The work says, embroidered, they dropped me into all of this. I was born in another world, and I can't speak your language anymore. He doesn't speak his language. It was stolen, like me, myself. Chava, as his friends call him, is from Cherán, a community in the state of Michoacán in the west of the region we know now as Mexico, in a piece of land that was named by some of the lost explorers as America some years ago. Cherán was famous because of being a sorcerer town, so they said, in which traditional healing is, besides music, a very important aspect of everyday life. Their main economy was, until recently, the production of turpentine and wooden furniture from the surrounding forests and mountains. In 211, there was a big revolt in Cherán, in which the organized women and men in what is known as autodefensas, self-defending civilians, expelled the corrupted authorities and police, political parties, drug cartels, and their hitmen, but their main enemies were illegal loggers. Deforestation caused by disorganized criminal groups chopping trees to plant hash avocado instead, notoriously stealing the wood, provoked also water diminishing from natural sources, besides affecting their income from pine resin and provoking violence, fear, and insecurity, threatened and harassed incessantly with extortion and murder. According to the INEGI, the Mexican National Institute for Statistics and Geography, there are 68 languages spoken in Mexico, not dialects, languages, with 364 different variable versions. But accordingly to Ayuk linguist Yasnaya Aguilar Gil from Oaxaca, it's only 6.5% of the population who speak a language different from Spanish. And back in 1820, right at the end of colonial period, it was 70% of the total amount of people who did speak a language of their own. Of course, the total number of persons on Earth increased speedily during the last century in a monstrous proportion. That's the scale. Figures change only in terms of the new political map of the world, in which, as Yasnaya, the linguist, says, it's not surprising that during this period of a political division of geography in monolinguistic state countries, many languages are disappearing in a pace not seen before, including the colonial stages of so-called history. And she clarifies that this might not be that bad if behind these wasn't human rights violations or of other language speakers, and if these laws didn't happen during a violent process. In this context, she insists, every linguistic event occurs to be a political one. When buying a subway ticket, or when writing a book review, and all speaking events involve an intricate woven tissue of different meanings that goes beyond the linguistic ones. Each language involves a culture with its own specific and diverse tropes and poetic turns, grammar and ways of telling. So this way, a single narrative annihilates all possible versions, not only as interpretive, hermeneutical acts of reading reality, and which we inhabited, but also in terms of belonging to any possible community or even something you can call the self. In her book, Un Nosotros sin Estado, a Stateless Us, Yasnaya confirms those nations that didn't conform states mean the negation of state project. Most of them are known as indigenous nations or peoples. Far from its etymological meaning, indigenous is a political category, more than a cultural one. Neither it's a racial one, although it's been racialized. Indigenous are stateless nations. And because of that, indigenous are the Ainu in Japan, Sami in Norway, Mije in Oaxaca, and it's linked as well to Catalonian and Scottish people. We are all indigenous. In all their deep and eventually culturally incompatible differences, it's just that these are not states, but we are nations. Languages don't die, they are killed. The state is erasing them. Yasnaya concludes. Now again, thinking about diversity and contradiction, not only in terms of cultural and linguistic differences, when discussing indigeneity, I ask myself again what it means being an indigenous artist in 21st century. Myself, I'm an artist. I'm not a curator. Contradiction again. What's the self? What's nature? What's life? Me, I have some Purepecha and Ñañú blood in myself. But of course I have some Spanish blood. And because of that I have some Arabic blood. And for sure I have some Jewish blood. And for sure I have some black blood and Asian. I don't know the percentages, but I'm sure I'm kind of Korean as well. I'm not joking. Who I am what we are, what we need to be. All works included in the section of Mexico in the Indigenous Histories show makes this question to each other. The friction with the other sections and exhibitions within the same show, in the contradiction as well, produces some hope that we could keep asking ourselves this: how to belong with no nationalism, no purity idealizations, no conflict, no borders, with respect and dignity. Peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abraham. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Sandra Gamarra, representing now the region of Peru. She is an artist with a rich career. She created in 2002 the LIMAC, a real fake museum, as a response to the institutional vacuum in Peru. She is at present also the curator of the Spanish Pavilion at the 2024 Venice Biennial. Welcome, Sandra.
Well, I'm Sandra Gamarra. I come from Peru. A little bit about me. I was born in Lima, where I grew up, and obtained my bachelor's degree in painting in the Catholic University. I was raised in a family between two cultures. My father, Peruvian, comes from an Indian background, and my mother comes from the Japanese colony that immigrated to Peru in the the last century. When I started my career as a young painter in the mid-90s, I recognized myself as a Western artist. In fact, my appropriations were a form of projection of that tradition. A distorted echo, perhaps, but understood nonetheless as part of a common process. Later, when I arrived in Spain in 2002, I began to visit museums. During my academic training in Peru, museum going was almost an absent element, given the weak cultural infrastructure in Peru. This was the first time I saw works and buildings that I had only seen on paper. I visited art museums as well as the natural history, archaeology, decorative art museums. I had a special interest in the National Museum of Anthropology in Madrid. I wanted to see Los Cuadros de Castas, the miscegenation pictorial series that were commissioned by Viceroy Amat and that you can see in the exhibition. There are the only cuadros de castas painted in Peru. This colonial painting genre, originated in Mexico during the 18th century, showed and categorized the different products resulting from the mixture of the three ethnic groups that coexisted in the viceroyalties. To my surprise, the series was not shown in the permanent collection. I only found one painting from a Mexican group, isolated from the whole. Because of this, almost unrecognizable, to the point that it seemed to tell another story. The surprise continued when, after seeing the floors dedicated to each continent, I did not find the one for Europe. I asked one of the guides about this, and he was surprised by my question. He told me that I have to go to other museums. That, he said, was history, and history is not here. I realized that there were two histories, and that the idea of common history only existed in the other side of the world. Neither in the Prado Museum nor in any other museum, the people and cultures of America appear as an integral part of Spanish history. On the contrary, we were constituted in a void, as Esther Guevara illustrated in her article, The Bermuda Museum Triangle. We only began to exist in modern art, and especially in contemporary art, but as part of a general openness to other stories. I began to be suspicious of the notion of the common, whatever the project may be, historical, economic, racial, or cultural. Racial misgeneration, understood as a conciliatory project, even if we joyfully waved the flag of shared culture, did not end in the common. Rather, it ended in the disappearance of 300 years of colonial history. I'm not an indigenous artist, and when I received the proposal to be the curator of this section, I felt that I was in a problematic space. Thinking about what historia, means in Spanish. But the historias in Portuguese that Adriano and Guillermo wanted to share here were closely to a sensitive like mine, like I feel, fluid, changeable, impurity, fragmented. To think about this project in a way that moves apart from the Mestizo project that erases processes that do not relate to what we call progress, I propose bringing in another Mestizo project, the one that José María Arguedas personified. José María Arguedas was born in Andahuaylas in the southern highlands of Peru in 1911. He became one of the most relevant thinkers, and I want to say feelers. He feels like more than think like. As he promoted the preservation and dissemination of Andean culture. In 1965, he presented his novel Todas las Sangres, All of the Bloods. It was a time when there were heated debates about what would become of the modern Peruvian, confronting Western progress with Andean blackness. Arguedas presented a third way, the mestizo. Arguedas departs from the idea of common race and enables us to discover a multiple-layered mestizo, a being that coexists between both sensibilities. That is an active bridge between each culture, translating permanently in tension between the two, interlacing languages. An identity whose exists in conflictive because it belongs nowhere, but yet inhabits both. One does not understand the existence of one without the other in a project that is not of progress, but of life. As an anthropologist, writer, translator, and collector, Arguedas cared about tracing and recovering the Indian, paradoxically, both in Andes and in Spain. He was not blinded with the ideal of purity. He understood that the development of the Andean culture includes the incorporation of foreign elements in a process that reworks and resignifies these contributions. Translation is a battlefield where he puts this reworking into practice, confronting its limits, making it a place of creation. For José María Arguedas, the habitat where the Andean culture develops is a key character of his work and of their life. The Andean world is mostly agrarian, and the land and its cycles govern it, both in its generosity and its adversity. It is precisely the adversity that has taught natives the importance of acclimatization in each geographical context. A given product will not be optimal or suitable in a different space. The results are always multiple and changing. In this process, the incorporation of new elements is possible and necessarily, as long as it promotes and preserves life. Pachacuti, the name of the exhibition, is an Aymara concept that refers about changing cycles of the land and the time. But they are not only talk about big changes in the world, big confrontations between cultures. Pachacuti also refers about the change that happens in our body, in our brain, in our heart. Alone, Pachacuti happens. Thank you.
Thank you all for thought-provoking introductions. I would now like to welcome to the floor here Wasantillo, Nigel, Abraham, and Sandra to a talk moderated by Dr. Mathias Danbolt, who is a professor of art history at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Please, just take your seats. Matthias's research focuses on the politics of history and historiography in art and visual culture, with a special focus on queer, feminist, and decolonial perspectives. Danbolt is currently working on the contact zones between art history and colonial history in a Nordic context. Please, Matthias, you will take.
Yes. Can you hear me okay? Good. Well, first of all, thank you, Line, thank you, Kude, for the opportunity of being in dialogue with you. And thank you for really strong presentations that I'm looking forward to be in dialogue with you about. I wanted to start by telling two small stories as a way of framing it. When I met the first of you a couple of days ago, it was at the mayor's reception in Kjøttstuene in Bergen. And the mayor told a story of Bergen, of being a city of trade and a city of being on the waterfront. I am from Bergen, and I was struck by what he didn't tell in that story. He didn't tell so much about where the ships went, for instance. Because Bergen is also a city you could frame as a colonial city. Because for Denmark-Norway, where that was a twin monarchy, was part of a global empire starting in the 1620s with establishing a colony in India, in 1658 establishing a colonial territory in today's Ghana in Africa, in 1672 on the Caribbean island of St. Thomas, was expanded later to also include St. John and St. Croix. In Kalaallit Nunaat, or Greenland, from 1721, and also included the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Sapmi. And Bergen was an important hub for those colonial trade. And that's why we had a sugar refinery in Bergen. That's why we had almost the control of fish that was not only traded, but also in a colonial relationship to the Samis and in Kalaallit Nunaat. So Bergen is also part of this global stories that we're talking about, even though we have a long tendency perhaps to see that everything always happens elsewhere. So that's one thing. The second tiny story I wanted to tell goes back to October 25th, 1975, when the World Council of Indigenous People was established in Port Alberni in Vancouver Island in Canada, bringing Indigenous peoples from across the world together, including a large Sami representative group, which also had the artist and joiker Nils Aslak Valkeapää as part of it. The story goes by the Sami scholar Harald Gaski, was that a lot of indigenous groups were quite skeptical to what they were called, these so-called rich white Europeans. What were they doing there? Because some of the Sami delegates passed as white in that context. So some of the Sami delegates immediately tried to do a quick lecture in Sami colonial history, or the colonization of Sami, to say we belong here. But it wasn't until Nils Aslak Valkeapää, the story goes, started to yoik, started to do this traditional Sami, well, you could call it music tradition that we heard yesterday, that suddenly something clicked. So through that aesthetic means, things got together. And I'm mentioning this because Nils Aslak Valkeapää also became the cultural coordinator of the World Council of Indigenous People, and he organized in 1979 a 5-day indigenous festival in Sápmi called Davisuva, in Karesuando, with artists from all over the indigenous world, a bit like the exhibition today, also including artists from Palestine. That was a kind of, I think, an important starting point for trans-indigenous collaboration and alliances in Sápmi, which also led to exhibitions such as Arts Across the Arctic in the 1992-93 with artists from Sápmi, from Kalalit Nunaat, also from Canada and from the Russian side. So when we were talking about this being something radically new happening here, that's true to a large degree. It's the first time a museum in Norway is doing such an event. But it's not the first time that indigenous peoples are coming together, but it's been led by artists mainly and by indigenous peoples themselves. So now, of course, we have entered these stories into what Adriano Pedrosa writes, the apparatus of art history, or into a museum. And I think all of your presentations speaks to the possibilities, but also maybe the frictions and the conflicts of that. So it would really interesting to hear a bit more about what working in museums means for you. Because in one way I hear you tell stories about indigenous stories, and there is the question of art history. And art history is a discipline of nation building in many contexts. It's a discipline that has been part of a colonial project. But of course, you're also reclaiming it, I hear. So maybe I want to start with you, Monsantillo. I thought you spoke beautifully about how you want to work on curating differently, of how you work on consensus building, on kind of a radically different way of approaching the selection, the presentation of art. Can you tell a bit about how you've worked with that in this exhibition?
For this exhibition, I actually work collaboratively with other people in my department, so I'd like to acknowledge Michelle Lavallee, Jocelyn Puranen, and Alexandra Nawagabo. So this is kind of the approach that we take in our department. I think some people are like kind of taken aback by it, that we work collaboratively on the selection of works, on the writing of labels and texts. And we really try to strike a balance, especially in representing a space as large as Canada. There are so many different indigenous groups, even just like among the Inuit, they're different across all of the Inuit Nunang, where they live. So it's even just that, like to be able to represent like the differences instead of showing the expectations of like a colonial lens of like what is an Inuit or what is a indigenous person, what should they look like. But I guess speaking more broadly too, we have a permanent space at the National Gallery that is referred to as the Indigenous and Canadian galleries. And at the time when it was created, it was kind of, I guess, a more radical concept of displaying Indigenous works alongside with non-Indigenous works from similar timelines. Because normally in museums, you have a certain timeline that you want to stick with, or a certain theme or movement, and this is something that we're really trying to break free from, because it's really constrictive, and even just talking about abstraction, there is Indigenous abstraction, but it's different from the European idea of abstraction. So how do we insert ourselves into the museum to speak with these other works that don't necessarily have the same history to them? Sometimes it's met with a little bit of resistance, but I think now, like I said, we have a bigger department that we can kind of push to. Now we have, we're all over the gallery. We're not just confined to this space, which is more historical, but we're displaying Indigenous works in the more contemporary galleries. We're displaying it in the European galleries as well, to kind of speak to those histories and to speak to those connections. So I think, and that's also, we try to work more cross-departmentally too. So it's just a different body's view, but also insert that Indigenous presence as well, because we are located on Indigenous territory, so it's important to stake that claim.
I think it speaks quite well to, Nigel, to your presentation, because you're also, in a way, addressing both abstraction and how that has been read in kind of Western art history, and you're trying to kind of break it out of it. So that way I also see your part of the show as a way maybe to, both point to how Western art history has framed the so-called Maori modernists, for instance, but then also trying to kind of open up to other kind of Indigenous stories, maybe more than art histories.
Yeah, I think essentially the way knowledge is framed is what everything ripples out from that conversation, and of course through colonization, a certain way of thinking about what knowledge represents and how it permeates is part of a Western frame. And so when we're speaking back to that frame in ways that speak and position us and our ways of knowing, it can't help but sort of speak back to it in a different way. It's going to bounce off that differently. So that plays out in very pragmatic ways in exhibition making, in academia, and in the way in which we think about disseminating our arts and culture knowledge. So it's not news to us, but it's often news to the Academy, and it's news to the way in which Western knowledge controls that idea of what knowledge represents and where it's found and what permeates within it. So to me, that's the broader question that it's speaking back to, because who gets to shape knowledge? Who gets to tell us what's authentic and not, and valid or not, or true or false? So the way in which those are framed really set up the rest of the conversation around how we are allowed to be visible.
The question of collective self, or to think beyond kind of that category that brings us together, whether that is a person or whether it is a nation. Mm-hmm. How you coming from as an artist, how do you feel navigating under the moniker of Mexico, or to kind of, have you thought of the...
Well, I'm suspicious that that's the reason for Adriano and Guilherme and the people from MASP to invite me, because it's kind of it's been a question that it's in my work and in different ways in my practice, but of course my work is not about that. Mm-hmm. It's more existing reality, the way of the contradiction is. I mean, living in a country like Mexico is exactly that. It's a description of many nations that didn't become states. Mm. And as I said, and it's not me, it's the linguist I was quoting, her name is Yasna Aguilar Gil. She belongs to a culture and a people, the Ayuk people from Oaxaca. And she says that we are all exactly that, nations that were, they try to erase these nations, but just because they didn't become a state. And that's Mexico. I mean, just right after revolution time, they needed hardly to create a monolithic identity, which is a contradiction by itself, the Mexican thing, the cosmic race, they called it. Can you imagine? And then it's a kind of a caricature. I mean, as you said, it's not really something to laugh at, but it's something violent and destructive. It went like, destructive for many cultures, like trying to erase traditions, languages, and the people's identity. So that's identities, better said. So that's it. And this is only now in 21st century, after 500 years of colonization, that we are still trying to push for reclaiming something that is not lost. There's something there that is being hidden. It's being, but I mean, many artists, of course, are not dealing with that as a subject matter, but as part of reality and everyday life. So when it illustrates, the art illustrates that, it goes propaganda. It's not about that. And then of course, when talking about art early, 100 years ago, after revolution time, the government created this apparatus of propaganda with the mural painting that was led by men. And there is an artist in the show, in the section of whatever it's called Mexico now, Maria Izquierdo, that is a painting of a woman trying to stand up, rising up with a fist like this. And this is a painter from that time, Maria Izquierdo, who was kind of erased or oppressed by this male patriarchal power of painters, the mural painters. And I mean, it's there. You know, there is no exotism in that painting. There is no male gaze trying to exoticize the women's bodies. But it's herself showing herself in a desert. That's a landscape. That's a landscape.
Oh, I have so many questions, but I wanted to get everyone into the conversation, and then we can return to some of this. Sandra, because you also, I think, create a very visceral encounter with kind of disturbing the viewer. Maybe it's disturbing also the institution, normal way of presenting works. You literally turn things around. You turn around both some of the historical works. One of the first work you see, or at least I saw when I came in to the right, is that historical work of a Christian work that is like literally turned on its head. But it's a consistent thing, which I think, of course, has so many different meanings. But can you say something about that? It feels such a powerful. You really need to reorient your way of being in the gallery.
When I was invited to present a project, I was for me it was very difficult to think about a concept, one concept that can reunion all the Andean and Amazonic culture, because they are very different, and at the same time they are very close. But I'm not part of them, so I think, I thought that for me, it was comfortable to think about in a theme that Western culture introduced to these other cultures. And the idea of portrait is for us is natural and it's common, but because we live in an individual world. But for other communities, that the common is the most important thing in their lives, and the common, not only the common, the human the human as a common, the common with the land, with the vegetables, with the animals. And in this context, the mask is a tool to be to be the other, but this other is inside of you. It's not the other outside of you. And when I was invited, when I was inviting the artist, in Peru we were living a very conflicted moment. A lot of people from regions from Peru was walking to the capital to protest against the government, and in this moment were killed most of 50 people because they are Indians, because they were Indians or natives or Indian people and Amazonic people as well. And for me and for the artists, we were talking about the moment and how to show in the exhibition our feelings, and those feelings there was not only in the objects. There were in the way we show the objects, and naturally we thought maybe torn down or put like you can see in the exhibition.
I think it's such an effective thing to do, really, because it also kind of, I guess, confronts the question of habits and knowledges, and what knowledges some have and others might not have. But what is also striking in many of the parts of the exhibition, and also in the others that we will speak about in a second, is also this mixture of so-called historical work and contemporary work. And now, of course, maybe to make that division is part of the dull academic ways of thinking that the past and the present is separate. Because I think you provide in your text, Sandra, talking about space-times and talking about there are different indigenous, cosmologies that organize time differently than that. But can you maybe say something about, because you also have, so-called old works, historical works in your show. How do you, what does that mean to you?
Well, it's something I think I heard myself saying the same sometimes, but it's necessary to say it again, that before and after colonial times, it was, the art as a paradigm, as a word, as a concept, didn't exist. So it's a Western term, and then we have a codex that is from, it's a calendar, it's a tool. It just says the seasons of the year, the days, and what to do every season in terms of agriculture and culture and life and traditions and rituals, of course. That's the Codex Borgia, is the Bourbonic Codex that it's in the library, in the Mitterrand Library in Paris. This is one of the few codex that was not destroyed by the Spanish people. All of them were burnt. This facsimilar copy that we have in the exhibition is the only work that we have historical, let's say, from pre-colonial time. And of course, it was made by priests. There was no, or not priest, but the person that we could call priest now. It was shamans or some, not artists. Then after that, of course, during the colonial time, indigenous people have no access to art schools or guilds. So there is no name of them, or no artists in the cathedrals or in the museums, because they were anonymous artists now. Then just only in 19th century, when they, again, after independence revolution, they needed to construct the identity, the Mexican building that didn't exist, putting together all these nations together to call it Mexico. Then, of course, all these indigenous cultures and languages were erased, as I said again. But as Yasnaya Aguilar, again, the linguist, she says, in no indigenous language exists the concept indigenous. So calling yourself indigenous is colonializing yourself. Unless you call the nations indigenous, that we are, that became no nation, no state. That's it. That's us, indigenous. That's the way. Then, dealing with this concept, I included some works that are also from modern times, from Mexico, including, of course, like peculiar works that you will see in the show, you saw maybe, that are dealing with this gaze on the self as a problematic one, contradictory, unstable, stupid, inefficient, like me. So that's the way I dealt with this historical approach of art and artists looking at themselves.
It's interesting that your presentation today was called Indigenous ? And you speak well to the difficulties and problems with that term. At the same time, you also mentioned it's a political category. That's also what the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, that kind of political understanding of indigenous, I guess, definition is people were there before colonization and borders happened.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but in fact, today I wanted to address the similarities between the concepts indigenous and indigent that have no relation at all.
No.
There is no link, but they are very similar, curiously. That's, I think, my point is that.
That's super helpful. Vasuncio, in the gallery or the museum that you work in have also had a long tradition to bring together artists from different indigenous groups. The Sakahan exhibition in 2012, Abarakone in 2020, 21 perhaps. But all of those exhibitions brought artists together in a big, not necessarily just one big mix, it was of course thematically, but it wasn't sectioned. I think in your presentation you also spoke about the importance of specificity of First Nations versus the indigenous. But I'm wondering if you have thoughts on the indigenous as a potential for alliances, political alliances and solidarity, or whether you also have some of the kind of frictional relationship that Abraham addressed.
Well, there's definitely connections between all of us, and even just the words. Like sometimes, like it is a problematic term to say indigenous because it's like, what is indigenous? And like we don't necessarily. Like, sure, you could say I'm indigenous, but when I don't necessarily use that word to describe myself, and like some people might say First Nation, like there's the words that are used like officially, like to say First Nations, indigenous, but like in my community, people will say Mohawk instead of like Kanyakahaga, or some people like of an older generation might still use the word Indian, which is problematic in itself, but it's just because that's how they identify. So saying what is indigenous, I mean, it is, like you were saying, like it's that, it's in you, it's not a place, but it's more like what you come from. Yeah, I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but yeah, definitely like in those exhibitions and what we're referring to as the quinquennial, we do get external advisors from the various international regions, so that they can help us, they can write the essay, they can speak to like they could speak better to their culture. Like sure, we can relate in that way, but it's best if they're coming from that place, they're coming from that sort of mindset and values, to be able to speak to it rather than to be speaking for somebody else.
But what does it mean to come together like this, though, in this format, Nigel? Do you have thoughts on that? Like, are there any surprises to see the other parts of the exhibitions? Are there resonances? Do you, are you provoked, or is it something you...
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating to think about the breadth of what the conversations represent. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that they represent multiple things. I think trying to land on words to frame conversations is really what we're doing. Indigenous is proxy for a range of other more pertinent conversations that describe histories and people and ideas and locations. So they're a means to an end, essentially. They don't define the gaze, but they allow us a way in. So I was just thinking, as this conversation has developed, reflecting on the Māori relationship to that idea. So we don't call ourselves Indigenous. We call ourselves Indigenous when we're talking to the other and outside of it, because we're needing to frame a conversation. And a little bit like the word Māori. So we don't, while we term ourselves Māori, it was only a term that was adopted when we came into contact with Pākehā Europeans, because it was a way of conscientiously acknowledging our difference to them. And Māori in our language means normal. So it was a way of framing our difference. But like anything, semantics and culture, Indigenous, Māori, become points and positionalities to the conversation. The trap is that they become the points and they're not. They're just the markers to the conversation. So, there's work to be done in making sure that we're always in the context of what that might mean. So for Māori, we actually identify by tribal groups. And so regionally, that's the way we introduce ourselves. And I didn't do that today, which is really remiss of me. But, often when we are introducing ourselves to a wider group, we don't say, I'm Māori. We say, I am Te Raroa, I am Ngaitarangi, I am Te Whakatohia. So you sort of, you locate yourself within that cultural context. And I think, part of the piece of work is acknowledging and making sure you're on which side of the conversation you are, that you understand that they're merely a means to an end to the conversation. So Indigenous is a way of us being able to have a conversation. But I think for myself, the Australian contingents and the Canadians, we have a similar colonisation through the British. So this Commonwealth legacy has been a useful tool for us to collaborate in recent years. And I say within the last 30 years where there's been long-standing relationships and, a couple of them are here in the audience that go back a long way and have really shaped our contemporary development in that space as nations or Indigenous peoples from those territories. So it's always heartening to be connecting with that conversation, but we're doing it often actually. But there are conversations here that I've never had and that are fascinating, and that broaden the idea of who we are and what we're about. And I like to leave it in that space as opposed to closing down who we are. It's actually opening it up and being more open to those, to the dynamism of what that might represent.
I'm sorry, I'm told that we have to take a break now. We are a bit over time already. I'm sorry, we could have continued for a long time. But thank you so much for your presentations and for sharing your thoughts. And now we have a break where it's an opportunity to continue the dialogue in a bit more informal setting. But please help me give a hand to our four presenters.
We will reconvene again here at 10 minutes past 1. So there is coffee available in the foyer here for those who wish to to have lunch, the cafe is also open and has sandwiches, etc. See you. Dear everyone, we are commencing again with part 2 of the curator's talk. And I will now be welcoming Irene Snaby, representing the Sápmi region. She's a PhD fellow at the Arctic University of Norway and a member of the research group Worlding Northern Arts. She has researched and worked in the field of Sami art since the early 90s and written numerous articles and lectured widely on the subject of Sami art. Please, welcome Irene.
Thank you, Lina. As you all know, the Sami people live in 4 countries, in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And today I want to talk about an artist that comes from the Sea Sami area on the Norwegian side, the artist Ingunn Utsi. Her small yellow house here is tethered to the ground on Gammelstranda outside Refvåg. The powerful storms of the Arctic and the Barents Sea blows away all that is not cabled down in the wintertime, and no trees grow large and luxuriant here, as you can see. Everything you need to survive is either in the sea or growing along the ground. People have always been dependent on food from the sea. But in the summertime, the reindeer herders from the inland come to their summer grazing grounds by the coast, to their Verde people. Verde, the friendly families that look forward to help with any kind, and to exchange fish for reindeer meat and good company and stories. And here is Ingunn Utsi. She was born in the house that we saw in November 1948, not long after the Second World War. The restoration was in full swing. Everything had to be rebuilt after the Nazis' ravages and the burning of Finnmark. The children have to watch out for barbed wire, broken glass, and mines as they made their way into the new era. They were 7 siblings who grew up here with their mother Emma and their father Ivar Utsi. The children were not allowed to stay home for long. In turn, they were sent to boarding schools to learn mathematics, how to read and write, and not at least how to become Norwegians. It is an ugly chapter in Norwegian history, how the Sami children were deprived of their mother tongue and their culture, and in some cases with punishment and threats. In this way, they were to fit right into the Norwegian mold and become good Norwegians. And the pride of being Sami was replaced by shame and concealment, the feeling of being stupid and not understanding. The Sea Sami population lost a lot during the Norwegianization. But some of the culture lives on through art and literature, through those who meet and remember, and through the young who learn from the elderly that one must not accept everything, but be awake and fight for what has value, such as the fjords, the mountains, the fresh air, and being able to harvest from nature. As we know, all of this is constantly at stake, so the battle seems endless. Below Ingunn's house, she has built herself a studio, and she is actually sitting on the staircase to her studio in this picture. Here she works early and late, and she is best known for her sculptures of huge logs that she combines with plexiglass sometimes, which she describes as transparent as clear water and the wind or the air. And here we can see some examples of her sculptures with plexiglass. And this is called the yellow one. Both of those pictures were taken by Ingunn Utsi. So stone, feathers, furs, and other small elements are important details, and in some works we find broken, burnt glass and barbed wire from World War II. The beautiful meets the grotesque in Ingun's work, but never intrusively. More like little subtle secrets. It is the sea that brings the logs which drift ashore to Ingun after long journeys from Russia via Greenland, Kalalit Nunat, and Canada. No one knows how old they are or where they have been. In the studio, she communicates with the material. And here we see one example from the exhibition, In the Shadow of the Midnight Sun, that toured Canada in 2007 and 2008. So with chisel, axe, and knife, stories emerge that cannot be put into words. It is problematic for her that someone wants explanations for and about this wordless language. Ingun was one of the last children who spoke Sami language in her area. And that was thanks to her father, who did not let himself be cowed by the school management's threats. According to Ingun, he was a wise man and an eminent storyteller. In the evenings, the children and the young people in the village gathered on the kitchen floor to hear about the creatures of the underworld, the Gofichtar, the ghost, and other past Sami legends. By this, he passed on Sami thoughts and beliefs. Ingun's mother was a strict Christian and was probably not always as enthusiastic, but as long as they didn't yoik, it was a silent consent. In fact, she had a lot of her own hidden knowledge that she rarely, if ever, told about. In our exhibition, Indigenous Histories, we display the chikti, the mender, or bøteren in Norwegian. This is a wall sculpture with two objects made by wood, plexiglass, and feathers. This is an enlarged example of the tool that usually is in the size, when you use it, at the size of a hand, and used for mending fish nets. And this is more than 1 meter, the original work. I think you all know it. She has made this work as a hymn for the old Sea Sami culture and as a memory of the fishermen and women in older times. It is made for mending dreams, the artist explains, to heal and relieve. She has carved a southern Sami cross on one of the objects. This cross stems from the holy drums that was brutally and systematically taken from the Sami people by priests and missionaries from the 17th century. It is a symbol that reflects a holistic Sami religion, and it follows the artist in many of her works to honor Sami epistemology and the carriers of knowledge that, incredibly enough, has survived both Christianization and Norwegianization. Ingun believes strongly in the global importance of art made by indigenous artists. Their works are about dreams, reality, values, and contains a spirituality of their own. The creative works feel closer to the inexplicable than Western art, and show a strange longing that is difficult to describe, an understanding of life that is more open to awe, wonder, and fascination. Indigenous art is about values and is rooted in something special, which, according to Ingun, is what drives those who create it. Artists typically depict the society in which they live and their experiences in it, from both personal and a broader perspective. For Ingun Utsi, belonging to the Sami people means that the experience of history is different than it is for those in larger societies. For the Sami, personal and collective experiences are more deeply enmeshed, and this is reflected in art. Belonging, having roots in a place, is especially important to Utsi, both as a person and as an artist. Utsi's background, her experience, both good and bad, and what is happening in the world around her has created a political commitment which in turn empowers and inspires Utsi to constantly create new works. Her tireless commitment to her local society and the wider world helps to shape her artistic expression. She has materialized her thoughts and experiences and does not need a committee to tell her what she has experienced. It is in her own life as a proud Sea Sami and her own truth and reconciliation that we find in her artworks. They don't need beautiful words and great speeches. They stand firm without further explanation. And this is a drawing that I like very much, and the title is "And Time Goes On." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. Now I would like to welcome on the stage Bruce Johnson McLean, who is currently the Barbara Jean Humphreys Assistant Director of Indigenous Engagement at the National Gallery of Australia. He was formerly a curator of Indigenous Australian art at the Queensland Art Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he is also a songman, dancer, and a yidaki didgeridoo player. Please, welcome, Bruce.
Watermulliol. I am Bruce. I am Wordy. I am Birrigubba. I am from Ripid. I am Murray. I am Aboriginal, and I am, in this context, Indigenous. These are the ways that we describe, well, I describe myself from my country. And I do this to declare who I am and that I am an outsider here on this place and to pay my respects to this place as well. I am Wordy. Wordy is my family, my extended family, a group of around 10 family who share Belyando at our heart, the river, the Belyando River. I am Birrigubba. That's my language, and that relates me to other people who speak that tongue. I am from Ripid. Ripid is the word that we use. I define it as a cultural landscape, but Ripid is all of the groups that surround us with whom we have married and shared love and land with, and will always be connected through this sense of place and people. We share the same ancestors. I am Murray, and Murray is a word that defines our cultural region, the region that we share artistic and ceremonial traditions throughout southern Queensland. And of course, I am Aboriginal. This is a way to, I guess, define who I am in this broader context. There are many more parts of me as well in my personal, cultural, and colonial histories are far-reaching across the world as well. But I wanted to just start by defining a little bit about who I am. My Yiraki that I played earlier as well, I do want to acknowledge that this was a gift to me from two artists, Yinamala Gumana and Goimbi Ganamba. They're two artists from Arnhem Land in the far north of the country, where in story this instrument comes from. They own this. And they gave it to me because they know I go to different places in the world to talk about art. They told me to take it with me so that that I can show them more parts of our culture, and people can understand that our art is an extension of our cultures, our traditions, our histories, and our experiences. They're all entangled together. But today, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work that you see in the Indigenous Histories exhibition, but the way in which it speaks to the paradoxes and contradictions at the heart of Aboriginal art and existence. And I think we've heard a little bit about some of those contradictions and paradoxes already, but specifically in the Aboriginal sense and the sense of Western desert painting, these are really stark paradoxes because Aboriginal people have been in Australia for over 65,000 years. Our cultural traditions are among the most enduring, dating back at least 40,000 years. The marks that have been written on, for, and with the land have endured for that amount of time and are still being practiced today. Yet, Aboriginal art as a series of art movements is entirely contemporary. Unlike our Māori cousins, we have no modernist artists in Australia. We have no Aboriginal history of engagement with Western art, in a sense, until the contemporary period, until postmodern periods. This is really easily explained through the colonial process. Aboriginal people were so marginalised that we were not acknowledged as people. We were not counted in the census until 1962. So obviously, if we were not people, we could not be artists. My mother, of course, was born in the 50s. She was not counted as a human when she was born. So this is the backdrop against which we kind of understand our position in the world and understand our position in the art world. The Aboriginal painting movements, as you'll see them in the exhibition, started in 1971. So you have this great contradiction that an Aboriginal painting tradition, an Aboriginal art tradition, that has existed for tens of thousands of years becomes a painting movement in 1971. It is this incredible contradiction, but I'll keep going with this as well. Stay with me. Across Australia, we have so many different histories as well. We are not a country, we are a continent. we have many different cultural regions and traditions. Each of those has a different tradition. There are no less than 12 very distinct cultural regions in our country. As I said, I'm Murray, southern Queensland, so within each of the states of Australia, there are at least 3 or 4 different cultural regions that are very different from each other. Western Desert, which is the region that is presented in the exhibition, and we did choose to do one single history because to try to do all of them in one tiny space would, I think, do a disservice to us all. This region was the last impacted by the Australian colonial frontier. Starting in the 1700s, the colonial frontier moved across the country painfully slowly. And through my region in Queensland, through the mid-1800s, but it didn't reach the Western Desert until the 1950s through 60s. This was the site of the last of the frontier massacres as well. 1928 was the last recorded massacre of Aboriginal people led by the police. As many Indigenous people are accustomed to, that land was a coveted green space for a cattle station, so Aboriginal people were cleared from that land. At least one of the artists in our section was a survivor of that massacre. That's how recent this is in our history. And 2 of them, the brothers at the centre of the cluster of paintings, their parents took in the orphans of that massacre and they raised that traumatised community. Papunya is the site of the start of the Western Desert painting movement, and it is a government settlement. It was established in the 1960s, and it was a government administrative depot or settlement for the Aboriginal people from the desert who were mostly trucked in and kept on this settlement. This was the end of a period where these were places where Aboriginal people would be deposited, and it was assumed that they would be left there to die out. This, though, changed very quickly. In the late 1960s, and we're talking a period of 5 years where things changed very radically, there are huge civil rights movements that happen in Australia, and they creep into the desert. These men, they meet a young and fairly radical school teacher who's come from Sydney. The school teacher has moved to the community to teach students at the school art. He's an art teacher. And he was interested in and respected the art tradition of the area. He saw the children drawing patterns in the sand in traditional designs, and he encouraged them to bring that into the art classes. As a newly established government settlement, you can imagine it's very basic, white walls, box buildings, and they propose a group of murals in the community to bring the place to life. The children start painting these, and some of the senior men intervene and they say, we have the story for these places. We want to paint the story on the school. We see this school as a place of assimilation where children will be indoctrinated into Western ideas, and we want our culture to be a part of this space. So they lead a project and paint 13 murals. They call in senior leaders from across the desert, and this becomes a huge cultural movement. They finish these murals, and these today are acknowledged as some of the most important cultural events that have taken place in Australia. They go back to the art teacher the day after finishing murals, and they ask for more materials to do more paintings. And they went back the day after and the day after until it became untenable. And they established their own cooperative. They established their own company. Within 1 year, they have their own company that facilitates their art making. It's governed by the artists. This is the first piece of infrastructure owned by Aboriginal people. Through their art, the painters begin to find their voice. And against a growing civil rights movement and a movement for land rights, these painters begin to advocate for what is known as the ArtStation movement. Through their art, they're able to establish settlements back on their own land 400, 500, and 600 kilometres to the west. They create a painting space, and that becomes the centre of the community, places where people go to practice culture and to provide income so that they can afford to live back on their own land in this new society. These men begin painting against this backdrop of radical changes, whether forced, led, or embraced. And although many people may see the works in this exhibition as traditional and approach them through some sort of anthropological lens, I and we see these works as radical paintings. These are political paintings. They enable people to live an Indigenous life on their own land. Now, in many ways, the absolute and systematic exclusion of Aboriginal people from Australian society, and therefore from Australian art history, in some ways allowed us to circumvent the whole damn thing and arrive in the contemporary. Aboriginal artists seized that opportunity to create works that spoke to their ancestral traditions, but were charged with the power of movements for land rights, for self-determination, and were an unapologetic celebration of survival and continued existence in our lands. And when I go into those spaces and see those paintings, I hear music. You know, I do come from a line of musicians, as many artists in our country do. And I do hear political songs. And the one that I hear when I go into that space, I will recite the first verse to you. And this is the backdrop against which many of these paintings would have been produced. This is the opening of a song called We Have Survived by a band called No Fixed Address, who lived as fringe dwellers on Australian society. And it goes, "You can't change the river of my soul. You can't tell me what to do. You can't break my bones by putting me down or by taking the things that belong to me. We have survived the white man's world and the horror and the torment of it all. We have survived the white man's world, and now you know you can't change that." So, Bimbi Uninda, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you so much, Bruce. Now it's time to welcome to the stage the three curators representing the region of Brazil. It is Cassia Borges Caraya, who is an artist and also holds a PhD in environmental studies and a postgraduate in political philosophy. As an artist, she is a member of the collective Mako and has participated in many expositions, salons, and collections. She also is a curator and now in this connection, a curator at large of Indigenous art at MASPI. Renata Tupinamba is a journalist, screenwriter, curator, producer, and artist. She has been working since 2005 in disseminating indigenous cultures through projects. She has been curating art, film, and music, exhibitions and festivals, but also works as a screenwriter. She is also a curator at large of indigenous art at Masby. Edson Kayapo is also a curator at large at Masby. He is a professor of the Indigenous Intercultural Studies at the Federal Institute of Education in Bahia, and has a PhD in education, and is a professor also of this postgraduate program. Please welcome to the stage.
Eu acho que sim.
Eu me chamo Cássia.
My name is Cassia.
É um prazer
It's a pleasure
e uma honra
and an
estar
honor
neste projeto,
to be in this project.
pois sabemos quanto tempo de
Because
conversas
we know how much time we have talked about
e acordo
and agreement
entre MASP e CODE
between the MASP and Code Museums.
foram feitos para podermos concretizar essa mostra.
And this was to be able to come to this show.
O Brasil
Brazil
conta com uma grande população indígena,
has a big indigenous population,
com mais de 300 etnias
more than 300 ethnicities,
e com 270 línguas,
and 270 languages.
que não são dialetos.
They're not dialects.
Estou falando em línguas.
I'm talking about language.
Nós, curadores,
We, the curators,
pensamos para essa mostra viajante
think that for this show, which is a traveling one,
pois esperamos que essa exposição viaje o mundo todo.
we hope that this exhibition will travel around the world, the whole world.
Pensamos em abranger o máximo possível
We try to have the broadest scope possible
de artistas e etnias diferentes.
regarding artists and different artists and ethnicities.
E isto é um marco.
And this is a landmark.
Pensamos em abranger
We thought about having together
o máximo de técnicas e linguagens,
the largest number of techniques and languages.
Pensamos também
We thought also about
em mostrar
to show
a diversidade
the diversity
de nossos mundos existentes,
of our existing worlds,
pois
because
sonhamos,
we dream,
vivemos
we live
e lutamos
and we
por
fight
nossos territórios
for our territories
e direitos.
and rights.
Direitos esses
These rights
que nos foi tirados
have been taken from us
por mais de 500 anos de invasão.
for more of 500 years of invasion.
Não dá para esquecer o apagamento.
We cannot forget the erasing,
Ainda em curso até hoje.
it is still going on.
Cada dia
Each day
é uma luta
is a fight
e ela é constante.
and a constant one.
Mas resistimos
But we resist,
e isso é necessário,
and this is necessary
pois
because
nossa poesia
our poetry
está no verde
is in the green
da floresta em pé.
of the forest that's standing.
Somos o ar puro
We are the pure air,
necessário.
the necessary air.
E a água
And the water,
translúcida,
transparent,
sem mercúrio.
without mercury.
Se pensarmos
If we think
na arte contemporânea ocidental
about contemporary Western art
como
as
a que não separa
the one that does not separate
arte e vida,
art and life,
nós artistas indígenas
we indigenous artists
sempre fomos contemporâneos,
have always been contemporary,
pois nunca fizemos
because we never
essa distinção
did a distinction
entre arte e vida.
between art and life.
Cozinhamos com arte,
We make food with art
através da nossa cerâmica.
through our ceramics.
Vestimos arte,
We dress art
feita com as linhas de algodão
made of cotton lines or threads
de nossas tecelagens.
from our workshops.
Nosso corpo
Our body
serve de suporte
is a support
para nossas pinturas corporais.
for our body paintings.
Nossa arte
Our art
diz
says
de nossos territórios.
about our territories.
Temos consciência
We are conscious about
da nossa ancestralidade
our ancestry,
e respeitamos
and we respect
e damos continuidade
and we give continuity
ao passado
to the past,
e seguimos em frente,
and we go straight forward,
firmes
straight
para o futuro.
to the future.
Em nosso coletivo
In our collective
de curadores,
of curators,
trouxemos para esta mostra do Brasil
we brought with us for this show from Brazil
a nossa diversidade
our diversity,
e acreditamos
and we believe
que o tempo
that time
ou o não tempo
or not time
seria
would be
nosso ponto comum
our common point
de convergência
of convergency
entre
between
nossos povos.
our peoples.
São 25 artistas
There are 25 artists
que gritam
that shout out loud
questões diversas,
different questions
como ancestralidade
as ancestry
e atualidades.
and actualities.
Vivemos
We live
momento ímpar
incomparable moment
no Brasil
in Brazil,
e temos certeza
and we're sure
que estamos reescrevendo
that we are rewriting
a história da arte.
art history.
A decolonização
Decolonization
é assunto
is a subject
extremamente necessária
extremely necessary
e urgente.
and urgent.
E esses artistas
And these artists
que trouxemos
that we brought with us
é exemplo disso.
are an example of that.
São artistas
They're artists
que trabalham
that work
com pinturas,
with paintings,
performance,
performance,
escultura,
sculpture,
cerâmica,
ceramics,
objetos,
objects,
tecelagem
tapestry,
e com temas diversos,
and different themes
como cosmologia,
as cosmology,
ancestralidade,
ancestry,
questões de gênero e sexualidade,
questions of gender and sexuality,
vida
life,
e política.
and politics.
Já ouvi
I've heard
Coisas como,
things like,
principalmente na Bienal de Veneza,
especially in the Venice Biennale,
não entendi esse tipo de pintura
I don't understand this kind of painting,
e nem essa arte.
nor this art.
Mas para finalizar,
But to finish,
eu gostaria
I would like
de dizer
to say
que
that
a minha resposta
my answer
a este questionamento
to all these questions
é
is
2 pontos.
2 points.
Entre,
Between,
seja bem-vindo,
come in, you're welcome.
e se dispa,
And take off your clothes.
por favor.
Please,
Fique nu
be naked
de todos os preconceitos
from all preconcepts.
e deixe seu corpo
And let your body
sentir
feel
a estética
the statics
literalmente.
literally.
Desadormeçam.
Do not sleep,
Para o outro.
and do that for the other.
Esse outro que não é você,
This other one who's not you,
mas que é tão verdadeiro
but who is so true
como
as
qualquer verdade.
any truth.
Isso é uma realidade
This is a reality,
e é humanamente real.
and it's humanly real.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much.
Pode tirar?
Temos de tentar.
Hi,
Hello.
voice. Estou muito feliz de estar aqui com vocês. Meu nome é Renata Tupinambá. O meu povo foi um dos primeiros povos de contato com os europeus no Brasil.
My name is Renata Tupinambá. I'm very happy to be here with you. My people was one of the first people of contact in Brazil.
São 524 anos de contato com a colonização.
We have 524 years of contact with colonization.
Nós, curadores indígenas do MASP,
We, the indigenous curators at MASP,
somos resultado de uma decisão coletiva de vários curadores indígenas e artistas indígenas.
we are a result of a collective decision of several indigenous curators and artists from the indigenous tradition.
Ocupar espaços como esse, instituições como essa,
To be in spaces like this and institutions like this
é uma luta que veio de muitos artistas percussores da arte indígena no Brasil, das artes indígenas.
It's a fight fought by many artists, indigenous artists from Brazil. A fight by the indigenous art in Brazil.
Nomes como Jaider Esbel,
Names like Jaider Esbel,
que hoje descansa, mas nos usam o honramos.
que hoje descansam, mas who is not here with us anymore.
Denilson Baniwa,
Denilson Baniwa,
Naini Terena,
Naimi Terema,
Yemolai Caripuna, Tayara Tucano e muitos, muitos, muitos outros.
and many, many, many others.
E aqueles que nem sequer não tiveram a oportunidade de chegar a esses espaços.
And even those who have not had a chance to arrive to these spaces.
Então, frutos dessa decisão coletiva de artistas e outros curadores, decidimos ocupar o espaço do MASP em 3 pessoas.
So as a fruit of this process with different curators and people, we have to decide to occupy this space in 3 different persons.
Porque somos muitos povos e temos também visões diferentes e viemos de regiões diferentes. E acreditamos na pluralidade.
Because we're several people and we represent several people and we come from different regions. So we are representatives of plurality.
E o MASP nos acolheu. O MASP, ele compreendeu a nossa necessidade de sermos 3 e não 1.
And MASP has received us. MASP has understood our necessity of being 3 instead of 1.
Quando cheguei nessa cidade, a primeira coisa que reparei foi o silêncio. Um silêncio diferente. E esse canto dos pássaros dia e noite, como se transportasse a outros tempos. E logo escutei o barulho do mar.
When I arrived to this city, I noticed something. I noticed the silence, and I noticed the bird song day and night. And also, it's as I heard the sea.
E me perguntei onde estão os espíritos.
And I asked myself, where are the spirits?
Então escutei o barulho do mar, cada vez mais forte.
So I heard the sound of the sea, stronger and stronger.
E dessas forças que vêm das águas eu compreendi.
And from these forces that come from the water, I understood.
Que são muitos à nossa espreita.
São muitos?
À nossa espreita, olhando como parecem escondidos, mas estão todos muito presentes.
There are many of them looking at us from behind. They're hidden, but they look at us as if they were there.
Eu espero que essa possibilidade de todos esses povos que estão aqui hoje, vindo por meio das histórias indígenas no Museu Cold, e esses tantos espaços que também nos escutam, possam escutar as vozes que vêm debaixo das águas, e se conectar àquilo que existe de mais ancestral, também faz parte de muitos de vocês aqui. E se conectar a isso também possibilita transformar muitas coisas na relação colonial que se estabeleceu aqui.
I hope that many of these voices that come through from different places, that come through from these different places, that you heard them too, and that somehow there will be a connection to these spaces here and now, and a connection to you.
Alguns falaram de reconciliação.
Some of you were talking about reconciliation.
Conhecemos os traumas históricos em todos os territórios que passaram pela colonização.
Os traumas?
Traumas históricos, trauma colonial.
We know about we know the different trauma that perpetrates all the different all the various people, and we've been talking about it in the colonial times.
Se puderem escutar as vozes que vêm da água e a força que domina essa cidade, que vem do mar, poderão se conectar também a muitos outros povos, mas começando também por esse território.
If you can hear the voices that come also from the water in the sea, if you can hear them, you can make a connection to other peoples also here, and to other territories also here.
Histórias indígenas é sobre isso, é sobre escutar as vozes que foram jogadas para barro de la terra.
So Indigenous Histories is about precisely that, to listen to those voices that were thrown to the earth.
Mas que também estão no ar, no fogo, na terra, na água.
Oh, but they're also in the air, in the fire, in the earth, in the water.
E em todos os lugares.
And in all places.
Histórias indígenas é sobre escutar.
Indigenous Histories is about to listen.
Aqueles que a colonização cortou as vozes, as gargantas.
Those that colonization has silenced. They've silenced their voices.
Quando eu tinha 16 anos,
when I was 16 years old,
escutei uma liderança do povo Guajajara.
I heard a chief voice from the Guajajara people.
Falar de uma liderança do povo Bororo.
Talking about a chief from the Bororo people.
E ele disse,
and he said,
o europeu, o homem colonizado, o colonizador, quando aqui chegou,
the colonizer, when he arrived here, the European,
pisou forte, pisou duro.
He was hard. He stepped in hard in this land.
Não só na terra,
not only on the earth,
mas na alma dos nossos povos.
But he stepped on our people's soul.
Os rios cresceram, a água do mar ficou mais salgada, mas foi com a lágrima dos nossos povos.
The rivers got bigger and bigger, and the sea water got saltier, but it was with the tears from our peoples.
Apesar de tudo isso,
despite all that,
se escutam aquilo que antes não escutavam, tem a possibilidade.
If you can hear everything that you didn't hear before, you will have a possibility
de se conectar
to connect
a essas diferentes nações.
To these different nations.
Mas descobrir a própria origem de vocês esquecida também.
And also discover your own origin that has been forgotten.
E isso é muito poderoso.
And this is very powerful.
Porque isso nos possibilita avançar.
Because this makes it possible for us to go forward.
Para além de uma humanidade,
beyond a humanity.
O entendimento que também somos essa natureza e essa biodiversidade não está separada. Temos todos esses elementos no nosso corpo.
And understanding that we're all this nature, we're all this biodiversity, that we have all these elements in our own body.
Não é como uma crença, é uma ciência que está na Terra e foi tão subjugada por outros povos em pensar que não era uma ciência dos povos indígenas, filosofias de muitos povos.
It's not a believing, it's a science. It is a science that's in the earth and has been silenced.
Então essas obras
it's a science just from other people.
Dos diferentes artistas.
These works of art from different artists
são também outras formas de expressão e a palavra arte realmente não consegue descrever o que tudo isso é.
Are also other forms of expression.
É muito limitante.
And the word art cannot alone describe what all this is because it's very limiting.
Porque são sonhos,
because these are dreams,
são cosmologias,
são
histórias antigas,
old stories or histories,
são múltiplas expressões de sentimentos,
multiple expressions of feeling.
Expressadas por meio de toda essa encantaria, que é como um feitiço.
Expressed through all this magic, like an incantation.
E é muito importante o que vocês estão fazendo aqui, dando essa possibilidade dessas vozes serem escutadas.
And it's very important what all of you are doing this, making it possible to hear all these voices.
Mas que precisam entender de onde vêm esses territórios, o que esses territórios passaram também na história e ainda passam até hoje.
But you also need to understand what these territories come from and what they are subjected to also nowadays.
Existe algo muito sagrado para o meu povo que está no Museu da Dinamarca há anos e vai retornar agora em maio para o Brasil.
There's something very sacred to my people who's now in a museum in Denmark, has been there for many years and will now return to Brazil.
E isso é incrível.
And this is incredible.
O manto tupinambá é como um ancestral vivo para nós e não um artefato ou uma obra.
The Tupinamba cloak is as an ancestor, a living ancestor for us. It's not an artifact or a work of art.
E as instituições precisam entender essa nossa outra relação.
And institutions need to understand this our other way of relating to this.
E transformar essas metodologias.
And transform these methodologies.
Compreendendo essas nossas diferenças de visões sobre aquilo que estamos trazendo para museus.
Understanding these different ways of seeing things, our different perspectives through what we're bringing to museums.
Porque é algo muito vivo.
Because it's something that's very alive.
E que toma formas diferentes.
And shows itself in different forms or shapes.
A voz.
O que ela falou? Temos que terminar. O tempo?
Então, o Brasil é esse país gigante com muitos povos.
So Brazil is this large country with many nations.
Mas que ainda são questionados dentro de suas terras, de seus territórios.
But who are still interrogating within their land, within their territories.
Falam de um marco temporal que muitos não teriam direito à própria terra porque apenas em 1988 foram considerados pessoas, sujeitos enquanto indivíduos. Antes eram apenas objetos do Estado.
We're talking here about landmark because only in 1988 have this different nations been considered as citizens.
Ancestrais como esse manto que está na Dinamarca e vai chegar ao Brasil são mais antigos que a própria existência do Brasil.
Ancestors like this cloak that's in Denmark and who will arrive Brazil are older than Brazil itself.
E eles provam a nossa presença desde sempre dentro do nosso próprio território.
And they prove our presence from always within our own territory.
Muito mais antigos que 500 anos.
Much older than 500 years.
O que parecia apenas um simples artefato anos na Europa. Tem outros também em outros países, cerca de 12, todos na Europa. Mas esse retorno pode garantir também a demarcação de terra para meu povo, que hoje está dividido tanto no estado da Bahia quanto também do Pará.
This that seems an artifact has importance also to my people who is now divided between Bahia and Pará.
Vocês percebem como é importante escutar as vozes? Podem mudar vidas assim. Eu agradeço muito a vocês.
You understand how it's important to hear these voices. They can change lives like that. Thank you very much to you all.
Eu quero agradecer a todas as instituições que confiaram que somos humanos e capazes.
I would like to thank all the institutions that are confident that we are human and capable.
porque durante séculos
because during centuries
os europeus disseram que nós não éramos humanos.
Europeans have said we are not humans.
O Papa Paulo III,
The Pope,
em 1537,
the Pope Paul III in 1537
baixou um decreto dizendo que nós éramos humanos, porque talvez ele tivesse medo que os luteranos chegassem lá primeiro para catequizar a nossa gente.
signed a decree saying that we were humans, and that was maybe because he was afraid Lutherans would come and try to Christian us.
Eu sou do povo Mebengocré, que fica no coração da Amazônia.
I'm from the Membrocré nation, who's in the heart of Amazon.
Sou sobrevivente de uma pandemia do Covid-19 e sobrevivente de um internato onde passei toda a infância e adolescência.
I'm a survivor, both from the pandemics and also from a boarding school where I had to be throughout my whole teenage years.
E que consegui me libertar da doutrina cristã e do papel de missionário para me transformar num grande ativista.
And I managed to liberate myself from the Christian doctrine, from a missionary role, and to become an activist.
Eu tenho absoluta certeza que a arte que os nossos povos produzem está vinculada às nossas ancestralidades e às nossas histórias de resistência.
I'm positive about that. The art that our people produce is rooted in our ancestrality and our histories of resistance.
E por esse motivo, assumi o compromisso de curador de arte no MASP.
And for that reason, I accepted to be an art curator at MASP.
Depois de séculos de muita violência contra os nossos povos, nós queremos fazer uma devolutiva.
After centuries of violence against our people, we want to give something in response.
Mas essa devolutiva não é com ódio e nem com violência.
But this response is not about hate or violence.
Nós queremos fazer uma devolutiva com as sensibilidades a respeito das coisas que nos rodeiam. Os beija-flores, os jacarés, as cobras, as jiboias, os sucurijus, as onças.
We want to give a response with a sensibility about things that surround us, like the colibri, like the snakes, jiboia snakes, like the alligators and the black panther.
Nós queremos, através das nossas artes e com a pedagogia dos nossos povos, ensinar o respeito à vida em todas as suas dimensões.
We want, through our art and through the pedagogy of our people, to teach the respect to life in all its dimensions.
Queremos ensinar, através das nossas artes, sobre a construção de um mundo melhor para todos, sem guerras.
We want to teach through our arts about the building of a better world for everyone, without wars.
Especialmente sem guerra contra a terra, porque o ser humano, que se diz inteligente, tem decretado guerra à terra pela água, pelo ar, pelo solo, pelo subsolo.
Especially the war against Earth, because the human being has started a war against Earth, both through the air, through the water, and Earth and under Earth.
Então nós estamos falando através das nossas artes que nós somos seres humanos de respeito e que a vida, toda forma de vida é importante. As águas, as pessoas, os animais, as plantas.
So we're about our art, we're talking about that every form of life is important: the plants, the animals, the soil, the waters.
E quero finalizar convidando as pessoas todas aqui presentes para fazermos uma unidade de proteção das nossas vidas.
I would like to invite all of you here present to form a unity of protection of all our lives.
Queremos convidar a sociedade norueguesa e a comunidade mundial por pacto pela proteção da floresta amazônica.
We want to invite the Norwegian society and the world community to sign a pact for the protection of the Amazon and life.
E quero de fato encerrar
And I would, in fact, like to conclude
lembrando que no século XI os ancestrais noruegueses estiveram lá no nosso território.
reminding you that in the 11th century, the Norwegian ancestors have been there in our territory.
Visitaram e hoje nós estamos fazendo a visita de volta.
They visited us and today we're visiting them back.
E da mesma forma como os parentes noruegueses vikings estiveram lá, respeitosamente, estamos aqui respeitosamente para apresentar as nossas artes e as nossas formas de pensar.
Like our Viking ancestors have been there, we're here back in a respectful way to present our arts and our way of thinking.
Estou me reportando a uma reconexão entre nós e pacto nosso com a vida em todas as suas dimensões.
I'm talking about a reconnection between us and a pact with life in all its dimensions.
Viva aos povos indígenas e viva a Amazônia.
Life to the indigenous people and the Amazon.
Please, if Bruce and Irene, if you would like to join us. Yes. As some of you might noticed in terms of time, the last, your section of the exhibition is called Time, Not Time. And now we are getting almost out of time, which I guess says something about how these institutions work at sometimes a bit more strict and dull time systems. So unfortunately we don't have so much time, but I did want to ask some questions and pick up on some of the things that I think run
Nós precisamos de tradução.
These papers. Yes.
Eu queria só colocar algumas questões para aqui fazer uma discussão sobre alguns assuntos sobre os quais estivemos falando.
Yes, sorry. So, in your talk, Irene, you mentioned at the end how Ingunn Utsi, the Sami artist, does not need a committee to tell her what she has experienced. I'm just wondering if. Okay. I'm sorry. Yes, so Irene, you mentioned how Ingunn Utsi mentions that she doesn't need a committee. And for context for that, maybe not all of you know that Norway had just finished a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was published in June last year, dealing with the...
Okay. Melhor fazer a tradução simultânea, né?
What's going on? Okay. She will translate in a second, but I was been told to continue. Yes, so Norway has just submitted a report of the Truth and Reconciliation against the Sami and the national minorities, the Kven and the Forest Finns. So Norway is just in the start of a process, because this report is not the end, it's just the beginning of reckoning. But I thought Wasantiu said it so wisely today in the first panel that maybe reconciliation is the wrong word for the wrong process, and maybe what we need is a is conciliation, the term about bringing people together in council to talk and to reflect, which I think is what all of these 5 presentations we've heard today is trying to and calling for us to do. And Irene, you are one of the few Sami curators with a long professional experience in curating, but you don't work in a museum now. And I don't think we have any museums in Norway that have a Sami curator on as a full-time worker. Can you say something about, in a time where we need to create a conciliation, to come together in council, what do you see as the urgency of also the conditions for Sami curating right now?
Well, there has also been a report recently, not just a reconciliation report and what has happened to the Sami and the Kvens in the forest Finns, but also about this cultural life in Norway of art and culture, and a big report that institutions were supposed to tell if they had cooperation with Sami artists. And it was not that many information you could extract from it, because the institution could just say, yes, we have had Sami artists the last year, but not the amount. And they were also supposed to say how much knowledge they have in their institutions, all these Norwegian institutions. And it's obvious that almost every institution, except for the Sami ones, and very many of them didn't have any people working there full-time at all. So the Norwegian institutions have very little knowledge about Sami culture, about Sami history of any kind. And we recently also opened the National Museum in Oslo, which I think is the biggest art museum in the Nordic countries. Yes. And we were so hopeful in Sápmi that finally they are going to get an indigenous curator, because they really need it and they have the responsibility for the Sami areas. And we also know that we have paid for this institution with our money that comes from the north, where they are getting a lot of resources from the north. But no, nothing. And they have now a big exhibition with the Sami artists, and I thought that, okay, they could hire a Sami curator for that exhibition, like they did in Koda. But no, just an advisor or two. So they didn't have any influence, but the crew at the National Museum trusted that they would do it themselves. So we are quite surprised, not surprised really, but we see now that they are not planning to expand their knowledge at all. They are just going to pay a little bit when they need it. And as I told everybody yesterday, and that most of you know, we don't have a Sami art museum. And we have very few people working who are paid for working with Sami art at all in Norway, Sweden, Finland. So we are still hoping for that. So they can call their plans what they like, but really they have to come with some results, or we won't trust it.
Mm-hmm. I think the work by Ingunn Utsi Mender that you showed up here is a beautiful, almost metaphor. In one way, it points to the enormous work that needs to be mended, all the holes in knowledge. But it's also almost so huge that you cannot do it alone. One hand cannot grasp that thing. You need to be many people. So it is such a collective effort that needs to happen. And Bruce, you have worked in different institutions, and I think in your presentation and the exhibition points to the enormous need of knowledge, and how often knowledge doesn't exist for a lot of audiences coming from non-Indigenous contexts. which means that the element of ritual, the element of the sacred, the element of practice kind of disappears. Do you have hope for how the new attention to indigenous art, or do you also see risks in this new attention? Because I guess in relation to the paintings that you and the traditions you have pointed to, the rise into a capitalist art space, I guess, also have been ambivalent, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's always hope, and particularly through the work of Indigenous people in these spaces, interpreting and actually, saying what these works are about. It's so important and critical to the presentation of the work. This exhibition is just so rich and full of so many stories and histories that you really do need to spend a lot of time and be guided on those stories and histories by the people who've lived through them generationally. So that interface is critical between Indigenous artists, curators, and broader publics. So of course I'm hopeful. I mean, I have to be hopeful. I think all Indigenous people need to be hopeful. Although my cousin always says, "Fuck hope, we just need to do the work." So that's the flip side. There are all of the other forces around the commercial markets and flattening out of Indigenous voices and histories, and I guess broader complexity, which you often don't get. And it's very difficult to present when you have 120 word for a label in a museum. So I think that living interface between curators, as curators, between artists and publics is so important.
Have you experienced in the galleries you have worked in, where have you used other formats than label?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's lots of different formats, and it depends on the museum as to what their aesthetic is as well. Of course, there's lots of minimalist museums that don't like things like interpretive videos or broader contextual presentations. But there's many ways to bring richer dialogue and interpretation to the works. But you are constantly pushing to find that balance.
In the section of the exhibition called Activism, there are quite a few works addressing Sami contemporary politics right now, and the fact that Sami activists are protesting the extractivist economies of the Norwegian government, of windmill parks in reindeer herder territories, and there's been many court cases ongoing, pointing to the urgency that these are not histories happening in the past, these are contemporary urgencies happening in the present. And Kasia, Renata, and Edson, you spoke also about the importance of the urgency of connecting ecology, survival, and that art is a natural way to. How does the institution give space for that?
Tudo é fruto de muita luta de muitos outros, e as instituições acabaram também abrindo esse espaço por causa da luta desses muitos outros, em estarem muitas vezes até mesmo arrombando essas portas.
Can you, Hannah, hear us? Yeah. Doesn't she have a microphone?
Boa.
Wow. I'm not an official translator, but I will try to help.
Tudo isso é fruto de muita luta. E essa luta resultou nessa abertura das instituições a tudo isso, porque elas entendem que elas não podem mais viver sem escutar também as nossas vozes.
So this is also a result of the hearing. So they are really hearing the voices, and they are opening the doors for that.
E é maravilhoso museus que têm a iniciativa de fazer uma curadoria fixa de a presença indígena, porque isso permite, de fato, que as mudanças aconteçam. Essas curadorias fixas, e não em pequenos momentos. E o fato também de não sermos apenas curadores indígenas, mas curadores de um modo geral.
So she said the importance of all museums having a fixed position for indigenous curators, and just not curators for some projects. So it is very important to this issue to have a fixed curator in the
reconhecendo a nossa capacidade e não subjugando também o nosso valor e até onde a gente saberia falar ou ver algo sobre uma arte, mas entendendo que somos profissionais também de um modo geral.
Recognizing this value and importance and the capability and the capacity of those professionals to do the real work. I'm sorry, then I go to the real one.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you so much
Muito obrigada a todos.
And for the call for working, for doing the job, for not being hopeful, but also, as Bruce referenced his cousin saying, don't always fuck hope, but do the work. I think a lot of us have a lot of both homework and other
Fazerem o
work to do.
trabalho e não só terem esperança, realmente, porem as mãos no trabalho. E nós também temos que trabalhar, todos nós.
And now we have a short break in order to reorganize for the concert that would start in about 20 minutes.
A gente vai ter uma pausa agora para nos reorganizarmos para um concerto que vai começar em 20 minutos.
And there's so much more to talk about, so please talk to our speakers in the break. But first of all, help me give them a great thanks for their presentation.
Obrigada.
I would like all the participants, curators, come down on stage so we can also give them an extra big hug. Abraham, wasn't the year? And maybe do some photographs while we can. Yeah. Thank you so much. The concert starts at 3 sharp.